G'day everyone and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez. Thank you for joining me again for what is my 15th podcast, and I'd like to welcome a special guest. This is individual I had the pleasure of working with in a former life with local government about 15 odd years ago in Brisbane, Queensland here. She has now moved to become, and she's worked her way through Ipswich City Council, is now the Manager of Performance for the Coordination and Performance Department of that council. And I'd like to say hello to and present Barbara Dart.
Hello, Eric. It's wonderful to see you and talk to you again.
Thanks, mate. I appreciate you giving up your time on a Tuesday evening to talk to me. So the spirit of this podcast is to talk about individual leaders' leadership journey. So with that in mind, I'd like to start with the following question. So in what industry was your first leadership role and why did you take that on?
Look, I think probably, like when I think about this question, my leadership role, I think, was with the Local Government Association of Queensland. And whilst I might not have been recognised in the structure as a leader, I certainly felt like a leader within the branch that I work. So whilst it might not technically have been a leadership role, I do think I played that part for the branch and the staff within that in terms of, I think, assisting with a positive work culture and looking at, I guess, the results that we were trying to achieve with the branch at the time.
Yeah, okay. And this was with the Local Government Association of Queensland. So
I guess, look, the role I had at the time was branch administrator. So I was PA to the Director of Policy and Research at the time. And I also managed an admin team, but worked across the branch. So a variety of policy sort of spaces, like, from finance and governance and roads and transport, environment, through to your social policy areas. So I got involved, I guess, with the staff in terms of assisting them achieve the outcomes they were trying to achieve within their relative programs. But I think I really was a bit of a glue, if you like, to the branch. And for me, that role was where my passion for local government grew from. So.
Yeah, okay. So in your travels, Barb, could you tell me what, if any, differences there are in between leaders and managers from your experience?
Look, I think for me, management is about the day-to-day, the stuff you've got to do. I think leaders are people that you are learning from. Leaders are people that you want to follow and learn from. And, I've always taken the approach of trying to be a sponge with people, not in a bad way, but just that I am wanting to learn as much as I can from someone. Sometimes you learn stuff or traits or behaviours that you don't particularly agree with, so you're learning something there and that you don't want to follow that path. But a lot of the time, you are learning new things about how you can engage your team or the people that you're collaborating with in a workplace to get the best outcome. And I think as a leader, you can have some influence over that.
Sure. And just as a follow-up to that question, have you had experience in mentoring relationships? Because that's come up in some of the other podcasts around learning the differences between leadership and management. Have you entered into formal mentoring relationships or something informal?
I think I've probably done the more informal, and I've driven some of that myself, where I have reached out to people to say, is there any chance, we could catch up? I think, there's projects and workplaces that you've been involved in that I'd love to understand more about your journey. So I have driven some of that personally. Now, some of that mentoring might be, a couple of months, and in other cases it might be, a colleague that I've worked alongside or someone that I've worked for a number of years. So,
Yep.
I I've had many managers, so to speak, that to me were great leaders and that I have learnt a lot from. Equally, I have worked for other people and seen leadership styles that I don't agree with. So I think at the heart of it all, it's about trying to be yourself and be true to yourself, but within the confines of a workplace can sometimes be a little bit hard, because if we really let ourselves go, maybe we wouldn't be employed. But um, but it is about professionalism and all of that, but it's also, I think, as much about being the authentic self. So
And thank you for saying that, because this has come up a few times. One of my early interviews with a gentleman by the name of Artie Raptis, who's the CEO of A. Raptis and Sons, a seafood wholesaler here in Brisbane. He said that degree of authenticity is something that people pick up on very quickly, that if you're not your authentic self and you're not real in the game, then people pick up on that BS fairly quickly.
yeah, look, I think people can smell that stuff out pretty quickly, but
Yep. Yep.
I don't think it's not a it's for an individual, it's not a pleasant experience to continue to be coming into work day after day and trying to be someone that you're not. Who wants to do that? Work plays such a big part of our lives. We need to be, I think, growing and enjoying that journey as much as anyone else. And if we're not, then, you know, you need to really, I think, be self-aware and reflect on what it is you're wanting to achieve out of life. And if that particular workplace isn't it, then you've got to be courageous and decide to move on.
Wow, I knew this would be a great interview, because you brought something up that the other podcast guests that I've had haven't, and that's not because they haven't been thinking about it, but this thing about how much time we spend at work. Do you think, again, just using your travels, because I'm not using my experience here, I want to draw from your experience as a leader, that leaders give much thought to that the workplace does draw out a significant amount of people's life, and that that should be factored into how they interact with people?
Yeah, look, I do. I think, like looking at where I am now, on a timeline in terms of where I currently work, and we've recently gone through a restructure and we're creating some new areas, and I'm in part of a new area, and it's re-energized me personally, but it's just, there is um, such an opportunity to be a part of something great in terms of where our council is going. And I think that, as I bring a new branch together, I want to see them grow personally. I want to see them, be challenged personally and grow as a result of that. But I want to create a workplace that cultivates that. And to do that, culture is such a huge part of a workplace environment now that it should be one of the top priorities for any manager / leader in an organisation, because if you can create an environment where you're looking out for one another, you can, when you're having a bad day, without taking it out on the people you work for, that you are supporting one another, that you are collaborating and learning from one another. Like, who doesn't want to work in an environment like that? And to know that you're supported and you've got a safety net there to do that, I think is really important.
So for those listening, I've decided to quit my job and I'm going to go work for Barbara's team. So where do I sign up, mate? That sounds like a place I want to work.
Look,
So,
but having said that, I can say that and it not happen. Like it is,
sure.
it is something you can't just put on a piece of paper and say we're going to work that way. You've got to. It's like any relationship. You've got to work at it.
Sure.
So culture is an ever evolving, uh, uh, you know, spirit, if you like, within the workplace. So I think that it's something you've got to work at every day, and it's something me myself, I've got to keep myself in check and make sure that I am walking the talk. So, as well as,
Yeah.
making sure others are doing that.
Yeah, I've heard that in every podcast around demonstrating the culture that you want to see by getting in and doing and being a role model in that sense. So can I take you now? It's not a negative space, but it's about asking about mistakes. So leaders make mistakes, and
Mm-hmm.
can I ask how you engage with a mistake when it's been attributed to you as a leader?
I guess probably define mistake, but I know what, for me, probably I have never been one to shy away from putting my hand up and saying I made a mistake, and because of one, I think that's part of your learning. But also, I'm never going to throw someone under the bus to save myself. So, if there was someone in my team and we've got something wrong or whatever, I will be putting my hand up to take that blame. I think probably some of the mistakes I've made personally that I struggle with more than the tangible outputs of something wrong in a document or
Yep.
anything like that is more around relationships. So I'm continually learning from my own mistakes, and one area in particular is probably one that I have to focus on is I tend to try and be a peacemaker. I am, if you've ever done any personality profile, I'm a 9 on the Enneagram, so I am very much about relationships with people and keeping the peace, so to speak. But I need to be able to, as a leader and a manager, have hard conversations with staff when there's issues that need to be addressed, because rather than shying away from them and trying to keep the peace, if I don't have that hard conversation, I actually may be doing them a disservice. So
Right.
sometimes, because that's how they're going to learn as well. So over the years, where I may have shied away from a conversation because I felt I was going to upset them, so I'd rather cloak it in something nice.
Yep.
Now I recognise that having the blunt but respectful conversation is probably much more positive in terms of their growth and my growth. Some people will take the constructive criticism well, and others won't. But hopefully, there's a bit of self-awareness that comes out of that process for everyone involved.
Yeah. So, and thank you for that. It kind of answers my next question, but I'll ask it anyway. What's the most difficult part of being a leader? Because part of what I heard in your response there was having the difficult conversation with people. Is it the people management side of leadership that is the most difficult part for you, or is it something else?
For me, it has been. I recently had a discussion actually with someone because I was in this bit of a quandary about it. Felt like the higher I went up the organisational structure, the less creative, the ability to be creative was getting lost. So the higher I go up in a structure, the less I get involved in the actual of doing work and that sense of achieving, because it felt like I was perhaps focused too much on the people management stuff.
Okay. So
And
here's the thank you
yeah,
again, thank you for bringing this up, because this is
yeah,
something that hasn't come up in other podcasts around this thing of as you moving to a more strategic role in the organization, and that high level role, you're moving away from the operational side of things. Are you finding that transition difficult to let go because you like getting in and getting your hands dirty and doing that work, and realizing that the higher up you go, the less of that you'll be doing?
There's a little bit of that, but I think it's more like, as a project officer, I felt like I had a lot of, again, I guess down to the leaders of the day as well, I felt like I had quite a creative control, if you like, over the work that I was doing, the amount of influence I had in the decision making around that. So as a project officer, you're given projects and budgets and things like that, and I felt like I had much more fulfilling a creative need, if you like, as part of that process. But as I have been given these wonderful opportunities to be, a manager within the organisation, it feels like you do get pulled into more of the day-to-day red tape of managing a branch. But as someone said to me recently, and it's something I've been reflecting on quite a lot, is when it feels like that, it's probably because your balance between management and leadership is actually quite imbalanced. So,
Right.
and I guess it's about looking at the strategies around how I ensure that, in terms of my teams, I've got people that are managing, I guess, the day-to-day nuances of a team, and meeting those requirements of the people in that space. But also, I need to be able to give myself some space to allow myself to do that strategic thinking and, creatively sort of looking outside of the council I'm in and looking at what others are doing and how can we also benefit from, different approaches that are being taken in other councils, not only in Australia but the world. So it's for me, it's probably trying to implement, as I move forward, a great deal more structure around how I manage time, how my interactions with staff and things like that. Obviously, I want to make sure I'm still approachable, that I can still have those authentic conversations with people, but it's probably just putting a little bit of a fence around some of my time so I can still do the other stuff.
So, Barbara Dart, how do you measure success as a leader?
This is an interesting one.
Oh, mate, I don't get paid the big bucks for nothing, mate.
Yeah.
That's why I'm here.
How do you measure success as a leader?
So, what's your measure of success? So, not and this one, you can get creative with the response, because it's not just around, I delivered 50 projects and that was my measure of success. It can be staff development. It can be lots of different things. So, for you personally, what do you see as a measure of success as a leader? And again, it doesn't have to be strictly speaking about KPIs. Your deliverables in a job.
No, I think like a measure of success is probably about, if you're working with staff that have a positive mindset and you're seeing them grow. And I've been fortunate enough to work with some people over a number of years now, and it is really quite, what's the word? It feels wonderful to see these people sort of stretching themselves, and it almost feels like you've been nurturing them in a way, and when you let them go and they're standing on their own 2 feet sort of thing, it is quite an amazing thing.
So it's a buzz. It's a buzz in some sense.
It's a buzz, but I think it's also about, I constantly look at, what energizes me as a person. And in terms of work, for me, it's always been about having that creative influence. But it's also about having some influence, I guess, on a personal level, in a positive way on the people you work with, that they want your input, that they want your feedback or opinion, or yeah. I think for me it's probably more on a like a culture level rather than a
Yep.
output level.
Okay. Barb, I want to make three statements to you and get your views on these. The first one being on-the-job experience develops better leaders.
Look, I would agree with that.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Formal education helps to develop better leaders.
I agree with that, but I think, it can't be the only thing. Like, theory is wonderful, but you need to be able to put it into practice. And
Right.
I think you do learn a lot more on the job, so to speak.
Than any textbook could teach you.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, here's a controversial one. Leaders are born, not made.
um, no, I don't think they're born. I think we all, through our journey through this thing called life, you know, pick up these experiences through our childhood, through our teenage years, through our early work. You know, there's some amazing leaders that are kids, but there's also amazing leaders that, are in their later years and everywhere in between. So I think it's the patchwork of life, Eric, that makes someone a leader.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that philosophy based on my travels. And part of what got me to do this, and I love having these conversations because I look at what I've done as a leader, and I laugh at the mistakes that I've made. I'm like, wow, if only I could go back and fix a few things. But when in looking back at some of the experiences that people get, and I'll use myself as a reference point, you tend to learn from people that are good at some things, and you take on those skill sets and try and mimic those. So for those listening, I was quite a junior policy person when I worked with Barbara many years ago, and you were the shit in the office, mate. You knew what everything was going on, and you had your finger on the pulse. And before I met you in that role, I had a role with the public service in Canberra. My first manager said to me, "Who do you think's the most important person on the floor that you're working on?" And I, being an idiot out of uni, I said, "Oh, my manager." And she said, "Yeah, but who's the person that knows what's going on a day-to-day in the office?" And that's the office manager. And when I met you at LGAQ, I had this idea that you probably knew the ins and outs of the joint better than anybody. So if you cast your mind back, a lot of what I did to get through some of what I had to get through, because I had no background in local government, I went to you and asked you those questions, and so did a lot of other people. And I'll be interviewing some of those people down the track, and it's amazing what you learn from people. Even though they didn't have the title, so I didn't have a managerial leader title, and neither did you, but you really had that place running and humming along, and that's because you applied all those things that we've been talking about. So in that vein, and this is one of the selfish reasons I'm doing the podcast and trying to put some stuff to people that have had different experiences to me. Part of what I'm doing in my studies at the moment for my PhD is to look at what are the core capabilities of leaders into the future. And what I'm seeing in the literature is that strategic thinking and foresight are going to be the core leader capabilities into the future. What's your views on strategic thinking and foresight as leadership capabilities?
Look, I think it's extremely important. You've got to be able to, particularly in local government, it can be quite a reactive space that you're working in. So having that strategic foresight and being able to plan and structure the business, so to speak, but still allow for those, unexpected surprises, so to speak. I think that it sets you up to allow for the unexpected more. It allows you to plan, to monitor what is working well, what isn't. But I think, as well as the strategic thinking aspect, it's also, I think, all about understanding who your people are.
Yep.
And I keep coming back to culture, I know, but sometimes our view or perspective of culture within a workplace can be one thing, but, for others, it can be something completely different. And I guess, like when you were just saying then about my role at LGAQ, it was very much about being the eyes and ears for Greg in that environment, for him to understand how people were feeling. Were they stressed? Were they?
I didn't see or get any of that. My perspective of you in that position, and this is going. Correct me if I get the some of the memories wrong here, but for me it was not just that. It was more that when we had an issue around our area of expertise, you kind of knew the way to steer us, even though you may not have had the answer. But the relationship side of things, I didn't understand until many years after I'd left LGAQ, because when you're living it day to day, you don't sort of sit back and go, "Hey, Barb, can you tell me why you're doing this?" And you'd never sit there and unpack why you're doing something. You're just doing it because that's the nature of your work. But it's and sorry to interrupt, but this is bringing back a lot of repressed memories of working back at LGA, and it was a good learning space, because I think I personally was blessed to have leaders of very different kinds around me that taught me some very good lessons, and some leaders around me that I thought, I probably wouldn't do what you did, but I'm glad I got to see that, because they sort of, the melting pot on the floor that we were on, everyone was around each other, so you could get some sense of where people's headspaces were at. And I think you only get to appreciate that once you've moved into those type of roles yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, and that's it. Like, sometimes there's decisions being made where there is very much two sides of the story, but staff, for whatever reason, are only told one side of the story, and it can be quite hard in a position of management or leadership to be able to tell that story so that people understand it. And sometimes, you can't tell the full story because of, privacy issues or HR issues or whatever. So it is difficult, but I think at LGAQ as well, it was also about, we ultimately were a family in that branch, where we completely looked after one another. And, for many of us that worked in that organisation at that time, we often comment on, it was like some sort of perfect storm of all these people from all these diverse backgrounds coming together and being in the one place at the one time, and we've had, you think about the friendships that organisation has endeared for decades now. Like, it really was an amazing place, but it was an amazing place because of the people that were there.
And so that goes back to this thing of this culture thing. Look, this is something you and I, again, appreciate your time on this, because culture hasn't really come up to this degree, nor had I personally thought about it. So I've definitely learnt something today. So here's my final question for the podcast.
Okay.
What would you say to a younger version of Barbara Dart to make her a more effective leader?
Back yourself. I think that the one thing I struggled with was uh, confidence or belief in myself that I can do the job. And, it's funny when I think back on it, it was somewhat, I think, driven by the fact that I didn't have a formal qualification. I left high school in year 10. I started my, first ever degree at QUT in the year 2007. So that was even after I left LGAQ. I'm now doing just about to finish a Masters of Public Administration. The other thing I would say is, and it's something I think when I chat to other women, it's what we do as well. As a woman, we often feel, you can look at a job being advertised and there might be 6 or 7, selection criteria. And if we don't meet every single one of them, we discount that job like we can't do it. But a man can look at the same, PD and go, I can do 3 or 4 of them, I'm going to apply. And I think for me as a woman, I've always had this high expectation of what needs to be delivered, yet I've never had the confidence in myself to back myself. So it's only now, later in life, that I have started to back myself.
Do you think that's a function of your experiences, though, that you needed to get some experiences under your belt, so to speak, before you could achieve that level of confidence? So I know the bit of paper doesn't necessarily bring more confidence, but do you think it's just time and experience that got you there in the end?
I think so. And, I've had to push myself through some pretty hard times as well. And, when you're going through those hard times, you hate that experience, you hate that environment at the time. But when you look back on it, you actually learn so much, and that is resilience, that you can go through adversity and still survive. And that, I think for me, backing myself that I can do the job, and the only person I'm in competition against is myself.
That's an excellent way to end the podcast. Very positive note. I'd like to thank Barbara Dart for joining us. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Eric. It's been so wonderful to catch up with you.
It's great. I appreciate your time. And for everyone listening, this has been Talking Leadership. I'll catch you all again on the next podcast. Thanks again, Barbara.
Bye.